everyone, and welcome to Utility Safety In Depth, where we take a deeper dive into topics recently covered in Incident Prevention magazine. I'm Kate Wade, the editor of Incident Prevention, and your host for this podcast. In this episode, I sit down with Shawn Galloway, who wrote a feature article titled 5 Core Capacities for Sustainable Safety Excellence for the April-May issue of Incident Prevention. Shawn is the CEO of Proact Safety, which was founded in 1993 with the sole purpose of helping organizations achieve and sustain safety excellence. Welcome to the podcast, Shawn.
Thanks, Kate. I'm happy to be here. I really appreciate this.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. So I was hoping that for starters, you could tell us a little bit about your professional background and what kind of work Proact Safety does.
Certainly. I started, like many people actually in the safety, I started in the military. And after the military, my corporate career began in engineering and specialty process engineering in the UK. And I came home on holiday, and Fleur Daniel at the time was trying to get into this area of engineering, recruited me. So came back here to the States and worked in their Sugar Land, Texas office for many years, focusing primarily on process environments, petrochems, oil and gas, and pharmaceutical, and started getting heavily involved in process safety management. So my first approach to safety was more on the compliance side. And in 2005, I was recruited to join Proact Safety and oversee the consulting efforts. And that's where I started changing my perspectives around safety, because coming out of the military, when somebody said left face, we all turned left. So I was used to that degree of compliance. And I realized very quickly the opportunities to focus more on what are we doing to increase the possibilities of being great in safety. And just telling people what to do doesn't really get us there. So our firm, we're typically hired or engaged for one of 3 areas. We have many clients that are truly world-class, the best of the best, and they don't want to feel as though that they're kind of breathing their own exhaust. So they bring in outsiders like me a time or two that works across all industries and really seeing everything. Just answer the question, are we going in the right direction? Are we thinking about things the right way? So how can we do to, continuously shape our thinking? Others, on the other side to that, is when you have a great organization that's experienced a tragedy or multiple tragedies, and they want to see how systemic is this? Was this just one event, or are we doing things within our organization to create the likelihood for the other side? So I become kind of an expert witness on those. Most common, though, probably 80% of our effort are organizations that are putting forth the right amount of energy around trying to improve safety, but just not getting what they want, or they've plateaued, and they need someone to come in and look at things a little bit differently, because all progress begins by thinking differently. So we want to look at things a little bit differently, look at their strategy, look at their culture, their leadership, a lot of the things that kind of led to the writing of this article for your magazine.
Well, so I want to talk about a little bit of that. Can you tell us what prompted you to want to write this particular article? What kind of things are you seeing in industry today that pointed you toward these 5 specific capacities? And then can you tell us a little bit more about the work that it took to identify them?
Absolutely. So in March of 2020, when the world shut down, most of my work, whether it's keynotes or consulting or leading workshops, training, was in person. The COVID gave us a lot of great opportunities to have meetings like we're having right now. We can actually work across the world without having to get on a plane, which has been nice. But because of that, there was a lot of downtime that gave me the opportunity to write 2 different books. And in 23, both of those books were published. One was a fable called Coach, a Safety Leadership Fable. And that's because I find the most important people to shape performance and culture are the most undertrained, under-resourced, and underutilized people, and that's that frontline supervisor. So it's a fable about how to essentially become a coach as a leader. But more appropriately for this article is I also wrote a book called Bridge to Excellence and How to Build Capacity for Sustainable Performance. And that's based off of a model that Terry Mathis was the founder of our company, that Terry and I originally put forth in the public domain in 2009. And we called it the Bridge to Safety Excellence. But the more and more we were working with organizations, we realized that it's not just a safety conversation. Building trust, creating teamwork, making sure we have compliance, but we're building the right culture. That's a business conversation, not just specific to safety. So when I wrote that book and put all of the, here's how the best do it, and I had a lot of organizations I work with that weighed in on how they go about building their own bridge to excellence, I became hyper-focused on what I wrote about in that book called strut sappers. So you think about struts within bridges, and what are the things that might compromise your bridge to excellence? So it's not a matter of creating this bridge, and the bridge is a metaphor, but creating this bridge and then turning your business elsewhere. It's also a matter of constant maintenance and inspection. Are we doing anything that might compromise the integrity of this bridge? You look at the disaster that happened recently in Baltimore. Now, other bridges have built capacity for tankers to run into them and not take that bridge down. Unfortunately, that capacity didn't exist within that bridge. And look at the probably 10 years worth of impact, aside from the financial, that's going to produce. So in this, I started really looking for what are those things that might compromise this metaphor, this bridge for organizations. And I started identifying data points, and those data points started turning into trends. And then they started, to me, to become themes that produce the evidence of why organizations' bridges were being compromised. So if you think about visually, in safety, it's interesting that a downward trending curve is viewed as a good thing, where in other area of operations, that's not a good thing. But you have a downward trending curve of incident performance, and we view that as good, less bad things are happening. So if you look at just that incident rate, which is not a leading indicator, but if you look at that lagging indicator, and if the incidents start to go back up, well, to me, that's evidence that the positive things we're doing to influence performance are being negated by new or changing negative influences on performance. And I just finished a book, writing a book called Shared Ownership, which gets into the engagement piece of this. But what I identified is we have to look at it that there's been a change in one of three areas: the players, the playing field, or the game. And in some organization, the game has changed, how they're conducting business. The playing field, where the work is being performed, how decisions are being made, moving to automation versus hands-on, but also the players have changed. So I've identified 10 things that I refer to as the things that keep me up at night. And what they are, as I'll list them for, which led to me realizing we have to approach this differently, because what we've been doing to affect performance, when the players have changed, the field of the game and the game itself has changed, we have to look at this differently. And those 10 things are workplace shortages and decreased expertise. So especially in the utility space, the way that I describe it is the average depth of knowledge used to be pretty deep and wide across the organization. Now it's pretty shallow and thin across the organization. So you have less experience performing the work or directing the work. And shortages, just retention, being able to keep people within the organization. Engagement scores are decreasing. Gallup just recently said that disengagement's at an all-time high in America alone. So you have less people that are engaged in the work, that buy in, that are willingly participating, have a sense of ownership or shared ownership with what we're trying to do. Less training, and worse, new people training new people. And that is kind of that Xerox principle that we're covering something, but my knowledge of it to train you is going to be less than somebody that's been doing that, a line worker, for example, for 20 years. So that's been a huge impact. And then the corrective actions that I'm seeing are more paperwork and PPE. Some of my clients for the last 15 years or so have been measuring their corrective actions against the hierarchy of controls. And it's usually a layered process, but you go to elimination, substitution, you go to engineering controls, administrative controls, and PPE. If you just look at those 5 versus the 6 levels, just those 5, if you assess that corrective action or even a preventative action against the hierarchy of controls, we're finding that 80% of it, the 80-20, is more paperwork and more PPE. And that's dangerous if we're relying on new people training new people to perform the work, if we're relying on a heavy degree of administrative controls or PPE, which sometimes can be discretionary. I've seen oversight decreasing. So not as many technical resources or supervisors out there watching the work to help us identify deviations before they turn out bad and helping to align and remove obstacles and barriers to safe performance. So you got new people training new people with less oversight, less engineering controls. I'm seeing supply chain disruptions in a lot of industries, some more than others. So we're having to perform the work without the necessary components that we find to be critical to get the job done. I've also seen the normalization of deviance, and that term came after the Challenger incident, that deviating from the standardized or agreed upon practices becomes the norm and becomes normalized by leaders. So you'll see that a lot of times also like in housekeeping on a job site. But if doing the work outside of the way that it was designed becomes the norm and accepted practices, think about how dangerous that is. Then with that, we've seen heightened anxiety, stress and mental health concerns, and sadly, suicide rate has been increasing over the last 10 years. So psychological safety, a term coined by Amy Edmondson out of Harvard, has become an increasing topic. I was in Australia a couple of years ago, and it's now a mandate within that country that you have controls in place for psychological safety. I haven't seen another country that set that as a mandate yet. And then the final two are, despite the work that we're doing, I've seen evidence of, despite all the effort around serious injury fatality potential, the fatality rate has actually gone up in America over the last 10 years. So we've seen that in evidence from documentation, from looking at data, to looking at the evidence of work practices. And that came about, as soon as we were able to start traveling, which was for me, it was July of 2020, and I travel most weeks somewhere. So I'm out there in the field, on the job site, looking for these things, and I'm routinely seeing them so much that it causes me concern, saying we may be pretty good if we are, but how confident are we in the sustainability? And then that led to these 5 areas about how do we make sure we're creating the capacity for us to be great in these areas, which to me are those positive influences that can negate those 10 things that are really concerning to me.
Well, thank you for all of that. I agree with everything that you're saying. I am seeing the same things on our end. So it's refreshing when I talk to other people and I see the same things that they're seeing, and that we're trying to do something to actually proactively address it in the industry. So I'm hoping right now that you can kind of walk us through these 5 capacities that you wrote about in the article and explain a little bit about each one to our listeners so they have a better understanding.
Yeah. If you'll allow me, I'll state them and I'll come back and give some examples of it. So it's system capacity, leadership capacity, engagement capacity, cultural capacity, and strategic capacity. So system capacity is on the prevention and the recovery side. And, a lot of people have been writing about this lately. We've been saying it for 20 years, that just because you have the absence of injuries doesn't mean you have the presence of real safety. And we also can't set our goals at just 0 injuries and think that needs to be it. And if we hit 0 injuries, we must be good. We can take our eyes off of the ball. I remember jokingly, I think it was a Dilbert cartoon many years ago, where they said that we set our incident rate at 3, and in hindsight, it was a terrible goal because we had to injure a few people to meet our goal. So of course we want no injuries. I mean, that's a given. We always ethically want 0 harm to exist in an organization. But when we think it's all about prevention, then we stop putting forth the energy that's necessary on the recovery side. And that's some of the thinking that we've been adopting for a long time, that now we're calling safety differently. It's part of the human organizational performance that comes out of the DOE. I do a lot of work with DOE locations, and the idea and the mindset that mistakes are normal in a complex environment helps us realize it's not just about the prevention side, it's also about the recovery side. If you have deviations, and deviations are occurring all the time, there will be deviations you and I make in this podcast and discussion here today. So mistakes will be made, even with highly experienced, highly intelligent people. We all make mistakes. are we building the capacity for that mistake to be made? And if that's a failure, let's call it, it can be a safe failure. Or the mistake can be made and we have redundancy, we have backups, we have even emergency response. Eyewash stations, if you think about it, are a recovery mechanism because the event has occurred, contact was made. How do we minimize the resulting severity? Or how do we bring the incident, the state, back to the pre-incident state? So the system capacity is what's our level of confidence? Our preventative measures, hierarchy of controls, are effective at reducing hazard and risk exposure. And then how effective are our contingency plans and how we're approaching things that if things don't go to plan, do we have the right mechanisms in place? A very often example that's used in this is the space shuttle used to carry enough fuel capacity that if making orbit, they had a challenge, they had enough fuel to go back around and try again. So we run into the same thing with the integrity of data in organizations. You have backup power supplies, you have backup redundant systems and everything. So if somebody accidentally unplugs, we've all been in that situation, right? I'm sure, Kate, you've done this. You've written something out. This is fantastic. This is great. And you forgot to save it and you accidentally get closes or the power goes out and you've lost that. So making sure even you turn on that auto save feature, recovery mechanism. We've all done that. So that's that type of contingency thinking, which, the military, one of the principles that's taught in the military comes back from the Prussian army, that no first battle plan survives contact with the enemy because the enemy hasn't voted yet. I like to joke and bring up our great philosopher, Mike Tyson, when he said, everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face. So it's that type of thinking that even if you have a plan for how the day is going to go, what if the plan doesn't go to plan? Do we have, if we're out on the line crew, where's the helicopter going to land? Do we have backup systems to where if our cell phone signal isn't working, how do we call for the first responders? So we need to be thinking that, yes, of course, we want to be held accountable for our preventative efforts, but what happens if things don't go to plan? Now, the leadership capacity is what are we doing to create the acumen within our leaders that they understand the technical aspects of safety, DOT, OSHA, all of that, but then also do they have the capacity to get the best out of their people and to align people to our safety systems, but also to be out there with a positive degree of oversight, not policing them, but looking for, can they perform the work according to plan? Where are those deviations that are maybe taking place? And can we understand what's influencing people to maybe deviate? It might be systemic. And you take one person out, put them in that environment, they're going to be influenced to do the same thing. One of my clients in the motto state of Missouri, the show me state, they call them show me audits. So they go out and show me how to perform that, show me how to do that. It's not, are you doing your jobs right or wrong? It's, can you still do it in accordance with how you're trained? Are we identifying any deviation here? And let's try to understand what's influencing that deviation. So do we have the leadership capacity to align our people to our safety systems, but also proactively identify those deviations? Engagement capacity. I find that if you start getting engagement, it goes in this order. You get people interested in what we're trying to do. So let's say we're setting our goal of we really want safety excellence. They have to be interested in that particular topic. They have to see how it answers the what's in it for me question, provides value to them. Then they have to buy into what we're trying to do. So are we doing things that people buy into? And people aren't going to buy into something until they've had the opportunity to weigh in. Then are we creating opportunities for them to willingly participate in what we're trying to do versus doing it just because they have to? Then are we creating that sense of self-ownership? I own it. The great W. Edwards Deming, Dr. Deming used to say, people support what they help to create. So they have a sense of ownership. And then finally, what I'm arguing is the final step in true employee engagement, shared ownership, where it's that true brothers and sisters keeper. So we have some tools that we use that help us identify what might be in play that might demotivate the very motivation engagement. And are we doing things to add motivators where people have that sense of shared ownership? Then we get into cultural capacity, that even though one of the first books I wrote over 10 years ago was called Steps to Safety Culture Excellence, there's really no such thing as a safety culture. It's a part of the overall occupational culture. And I've seen a lot of companies hundreds that strategically go after improving their safety culture, and they have improvements, but they reach a point of diminished returns when they're not managing the experiences that people have, the stories that are told outside of the safety environment. So it's the occupational culture. Are we creating the cultural capacity to peer-to-peer norm each other? And a lot of companies, I would call it more of a safety tribe. There's not a lot of changes. When somebody new comes in, we're watching out for those people because we're all part of the tribe, and we don't want anybody on the tribe to get injured or to do things they shouldn't be doing. So we're constantly watching out for them. That tribe has been overtaken by so many new people that it's no longer that tribe anymore. And a lot of companies have lost that cultural capacity to norm people to the way we do things around here. And I've seen many evidence, one last week with an organization, where they saw an employee doing something that they haven't had to talk about for the last 10 years. It's what I call a risk we never take, because they took it for granted. No one would ever do that here. We all know not to do that. But that new employee wasn't briefed on that. So they don't have the cultural capacity to norm the right people. And then finally, the strategic capacity. Organizations have to have a safety strategy, but that safety strategy has to support, not conflict with, the overall business trajectory strategy. So usually I'll find a strategy in safeties more about failing less. And if we're doing things that produce fewer injuries, well, we must be doing the right things then, versus a real strategy as a framework of choices and trade-offs an organization makes to determine how to capture and deliver value. So how do we set a true vision of what safety excellence looks like? Do we have true data, not just opinions on where we are against that ideal? And then what are we doing to close that gap and measure what we're doing is not just reducing failures, but is adding real sustainable value? So I find those are the 5 areas we have to be great at over several years for us to build that capacity to deal with the work as it's being performed and truly achieve excellence in safety.
So building or improving capacity, when I think about all of what you've talked about, it can seem like a really big job, like a very serious undertaking. If a company is wondering even where to begin, like what advice do you have for them? I mean, do you go after all 5 at first? Do you pick one? What are your thoughts?
Well, I would encourage the audience to go back and look at that article that's in your magazine and ask some questions around that are profiled in that article. How confident are we in each one of these capacities? What evidence do we see that tells us that we are building that capacity and that we're not building capacity? If any of the listeners want to contact me, I can send them, so they don't have to buy the bridge book. I can send them a graphic of the bridge model itself. And that has been, since 2009, an excellent conversation catalyst for us to understand where we are. Where are we on building true leadership, on building trust, on building teamwork? Do we have the right hierarchy of controls, including rules? How are we enforcing those rules? What's our culture like? What's the culture focusing on? What is it reinforcing? So I would start with a conversation on where are we on the construction and maintenance of this bridge, but also go back to that article and take a look at those different capacities. Now, that's also why organizations will bring in someone like myself to help them understand where they're at on all of this, and strategically, what does that focus need to be? Because sometimes we do fall in the trap of breathing our own exhaust. We're so close to the issues that we're not thinking about it differently because we're in the thick of it. We're dealing with it every day. And sometimes bringing in somebody from another industry or bringing in someone from a different company to benchmark and share those practices prompt us to think a little bit differently. But I would start with a conversation, not necessarily on where are we today. We dispelled that myth in the STEPS book many years ago, is that if you do an assessment on where are we today, you're always going to find opportunities for improvement, even in perception surveys. But you could go after some effort that might improve a belief that doesn't do anything to change safety performance. So you have to actually start with, where are we going? What does success look like for us over a 3 or a 5 year period? And then start to assess, where are we against who we're trying to be? Because one organization, even in the utility space, is not ever going to be like someone else in their industry. They have different capacities, they have different competencies, they have different business plans. And sometimes it's appropriate to say our objective, just based on where we are financially as a company, is incremental improvement. Other organizations, they truly want to pursue world-class, but what it takes to provide the organizational resources to become world-class is much different than incremental improvement. So I would start with getting on the same page about where are we going as an organization, and then have the conversations, where are we and where are those gaps?
Well, so I want to go back. You had mentioned psychological safety a little bit earlier in our conversation when we were discussing leadership capacity. And psychological safety is something I hear a lot about lately. So I'm curious about your perspective. How important is that type of safety in terms of achieving sustainable excellence in safety performance and culture?
Yeah, it's more than a buzzword. It's a mindset supported by actions. And I would argue it's very similar to the principles and the tools within human organizational performance, but also within trying to become a lean enterprise. Like, you don't implement HOP in an organization. It's a mindset supported by understanding where the error traps are, making sure we have the right tools in place. So it's not something you really implement. It starts with changing how we think about things. The same thing with lean. Organizations will bring some tools, 5S, Kaizen, and they think that they're lean. No, it has to be a complete culture change over a period of time. And the same thing with psychological safety. We do have some workshops and we do a lot of stuff around that. I would offer the way that Australia has approached this, and you could find it yourself or contact me and I can send the guidance document. But Australia is the first country that has created mandates and thou shall statements that if you're an employer in Australia, you have to put controls in place, very similar to how we look in safety in America about having physical controls that are in place. Canada now has a standard. England has a standard, and now there's an ISO 45003 standard. But a standard doesn't mean it's a program. It's a way of shaping beliefs and experiences. And I find that's going to be the biggest challenge with the value that psychological safety provides, is it's all about perceptions. Kate, you and I could report to the same boss and walk away from a conversation feeling something totally different based on how we were raised, based on our work experiences, how we identify as just being a human. So that's going to be the challenge. But what if employees think that it's not a good idea to speak up about safety? What if an employee thinks it's not a good idea to report concerns? Those are all aspects of psychological safety that I feel as though the work that I'm doing isn't valued. I feel as though it's not safe to speak up. Those are just a couple of examples. So if we look at what psychological safety is trying to provide, that safe environment to conduct business and have those conversations, making sure people feel their work is meaningful and appreciated, I would hate to work in an organization that they don't value that perspective to begin with. So I think psychological safety is a term that's used, but it's more than just a construct. It's a way of managing people's perceptions, if you will, by ensuring they're having the right experiences and the right stories are being told. And that's a culture change, because culture is beliefs that govern behavior. So what are we doing as leaders then to provide the right experiences and stories? Because if we're not monitoring the experiences our employees have and the stories that are being told, the resulting perceptions will manage our effectiveness. So if employees feel it's not a good idea to speak up about safety, let's call that an aspect of psychological safety. So what do we as leaders need to do to provide employees the right experiences, evidence, and stories that doing so is appreciated, produces value? Maybe sometimes there's public recognition if that's appropriate, but all of that is just around ensuring people have the right experiences that generate the desirable beliefs that govern behavior that creates a culture of excellence.
Well, so in addition to psychological safety, another topic that you kind of touched on was worker engagement. And I hear a lot about that these days, and actually how it's waning. So In your consulting work, what kinds of differences are you seeing between companies who have high employee engagement and those who are struggling with it?
So if you go back to the comment I made earlier, that what percentage of your workforce do you think is truly interested in the pursuit of safety excellence? And let's just take that topic, safety excellence. What percentage do you think are interested and that's it? What percentage do you feel are really bought into that as an objective? And safety excellence is different than saying target zero, because a lot of times employees don't necessarily believe in that. Either they think it's not possible or they don't really know what that means. So if the goal is ambiguous, then they're not going to know what it takes to get there. What percentage are willingly participating in the activities that drive safety improvement? So what percentage are have to versus want to? What percentage do you think have a real stake and ownership? They think it's their safety program. When I first met Terry, the founder of our company, he was at a safety conference, and he asked the question, this was 2004, I think. He asked the question, how often do you wash in detail your rental car? And there was laughter, and there's maybe a couple of hands that were raised that, yeah, I've done that because I parked underneath the wrong tree, or I drove it off road and I was embarrassed to turn it in like that. But most people don't. They do the minimal necessary just to get by. And that's similar to how they view the safety program. They do the minimal necessary just to get by. So what percentage have a sense of ownership? And what's the evidence that you see that we have shared ownership? People are looking out for each other. What people do when the boss isn't around is an aspect of every culture. How confident are you that that's happening in a desired state? But in my work, working with organizations, the lack of that, the lack of buy-in all the way to shared ownership, the evidence I typically see, poor attendance. I see retention rates are terrible. I see the happiness at work. I have a manager I worked with a long time ago. Success to him as a leader of the location was how many people are coming into work with smiles on their face. And that was a very imprecise but a meaningful metric for him, that if I've got people coming in and most of them have a frown or they look like they don't want to be there, what kind of work environment am I creating here? And you're not going to get high levels of engagement if people don't like coming to work, feel valued what they're doing, feel as though they have a best friend at work, their boss really cares about them. If I think my boss truly cares about me, not just the safety numbers, I'm going to go above and beyond. But if I think I don't trust the boss, I'm probably not going to give it my all, just being realistic. So employee happiness, creating a real true sense of brothers and sisters keeper, you don't see that. You see what I kind of refer to as paycheckers. They just do the minimal necessary to collect a paycheck and go home and have no interest because they don't feel the company is interested in them. And we've seen that in a lot of organizations, those lifetimers, those career people that stayed with the organization, they don't feel as though the company has loyalty to them, so they don't really have loyalty back to them. So you end up with that culture of have to versus what we've been talking about here, that culture of want to. So that's why actually I wrote this book that'll be published later this year in 2024. It's called Shared Ownership. I haven't landed on the subtitle for this. It's because I find, one quick thing I'll say to this is, after writing that bridge book, the reason I went into the engagement piece, because it was the final piece of the bridge, is that a leader of the CEO of a utility, a department manager, the head superintendent of a line crew can't create an engaged workforce. It happens or it doesn't happen at that frontline leader. So if you want to know how many subcultures you have in an organization, at least how many first line supervisors do we have? That creates the potential for how many subcultures. And that's the opportunity to create engagement, is you have to go after it subculture by subculture, because a manager multiple levels removed cannot create the engagement necessary. It happens or it's not happening at that frontline leader. And that's why I find them to be the point of criticality. If we want engagement, how engaged are our frontline leaders? How are we providing them the tools and the time necessary to produce excellence in employee performance and participation? And quite often we create more barriers than we're providing the tools.
Well, so I think we've covered a lot of meaningful information here today, and I thank you so much for your time. Before we close out this episode of the podcast, is there anything else that you feel like it's important to share with our listeners?
Yeah, I'll share kind of my why. So in 2012, I had the privilege of delivering the opening keynote for the very first safety conference in the country of Azerbaijan. So it was 2012, and it just like if I was doing so in 2024 today, I would be surprised by the experience I was about to have. It was 2012 at the time. This is the first time country and occupational leaders were getting together to talk about workplace safety. Oh my gosh, I thought we were way past that. So as I remember that morning, as I'm running through my statement that I was going to make, and I'm running on the treadmill looking out over Baku and the Caspian Sea, I landed on kind of my mission, and that's to continuously challenge the thinking around what is and what isn't excellence and safety. So the concepts we've talked about today, if I had the privilege of being back on this podcast in 2034, I would imagine my thinking has evolved quite drastically. Because just like we've talked about psychological safety wasn't a topic for most organizations 5 years ago, let alone 10 years ago. And now that is absolutely a part of the conversation in safety excellence. So my challenge is continuously challenge what we perceive is necessary to create excellence. The other piece to this that I'll share, and I deliver this sometimes in keynotes, so I'll try to keep it brief. In 2022, my wife and I joined a really good friend of mine and his wife in Bali, Indonesia for his birthday in November of 2022. And to keep it brief, what he wanted to do was hike Mount Agung for his birthday on November 17th, and made it to the summit. It's a very dangerous trek, but made it to the summit. And unfortunately, 1,000 feet coming down, my friend had an accident and he tripped and he took his last breath on the side of the mountain there. And he was alive for a couple of hours, but it took about 15 hours to get him off of this side of the mountain. They had no capacity for if things go wrong. So I'll bring that home as hopefully a memorable story that we had to bring my friend home after being cremated there back to Houston, where I live, in a box. And that reminded me that all the work that we do, people are more likely to get injured or lose their life outside of work than they are at work. So we can't just think about the capacity for things to go wrong at work. We have to make off-the-job safety an on-the-job topic. And that goes back to changing our thinking around what is really excellence and safety, and what are we doing or about to do, and how are we managing the risks? And if things go wrong, what's going to kick in? Because they will. Things will go wrong. So I would just leave that final point there, that let's continuously challenge each other on how we perceive what really is excellence and keep pushing that. But then let's also continue the search for, okay, things are going great. What if they don't?
Shawn, thank you so much for your expertise and your time and wanting to share with us. As a reminder to our listeners, Shawn's article on 5 core capacities for sustainable safety excellence is now available in the April-May issue of Incident Prevention, which can be accessed online at incident-prevention.com. Until next time, stay safe and be well.
Let safety shine by joining us for the IP Utility Safety Conference in Orlando, Florida, this May 21st through the 23rd. Register today at utilitysafetyconference.com.
The views, information, and opinions expressed during this podcast are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of Utility Business Media and its employees. It is strongly recommended that you discuss any actions or policy changes with your company management prior to implementation.